Welcome to the Write the Docs podcast number 13. I don't know if anyone here is superstitious. I'm not, so we'll just go for it. It's not 12 and a half. It's not 14 alpha. It's 13. We have a special guest for you documentarians this week. We're down one host, but we have a guest as always. And how about I'm going to let you introduce yourself to kick the show off.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So I'm Abhinav. I'm the founder and CEO of Postman. Postman is an API development environment that some of you might use. It's Postman started off a while back as a side project of mine has grown into a company.
Okay. And I know we've spoken before, which is how it sort of came about. I have actually used Postman for clients and still do actually. So
Awesome.
more for API side of things, but we'll sort of get to that. And Tom, I think you've encountered Postman through some other avenues, through some of your kind of side project work as well.
Yeah. I have a tutorial on Postman in my API doc site, and it was like one of the third most viewed pages in there. So it's definitely a popular tool. It's one that is probably the standard sort of REST client that people tend to use in places that I've been. So I'm excited to talk to Abhinav and get the story behind it and all the other features that maybe a lot of people don't even know about that exist with Postman.
Well, let's start with that. So you said it was something you created in your spare time, but what was the problem you were trying to solve that you created it for?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, Postman began as a tool to solve like a very simple pain point of mine, which was sending an API call. So I had a range of experiences, building software, sometimes of my own, sometimes with other people, and predominantly we were using APIs. And what I saw as like a base problem was that when you were given an API call, you would have to build out the call, get the response, and just kind of get to that first step of success with whatever you were supposed to work with. And at that time, I found out like a whole bunch of tools existed, but they were very cumbersome to use. I would make all those errors, which I thought, at least I was like, it's a problem with the tool and not with me. And that turned out to be a good thing. So I just wanted to kind of build a very simple tool to help me send a request, to be confident that it works, help me debug that thing, and it started off from there. It was a REST client that I put it up on the Chrome Web Store, and it had a couple of nice things which I thought were pretty relevant for a REST client. For example, it had a history of requests that you could kind of go back to and say that, okay, now I want to send this thing again. And I was very surprised that browsers, let you see your browser history, but effectively when you're going through APIs and browsing through APIs, none of those tools kind of had a history. And that to me was like a very basic omission. It had a response formatter to kind of let you see the response in a nicer way, not having to go through the terminal, pipe it to a browser, and things like that. And slowly it added on more and more tools. But I just became so much more productive with just these simple things that I think resonated a lot well with other users of Postman.
Okay.
And now, beyond just making requests, the tool, you've evolved it to offer API documentation, integration, hosting, other kinds of features. Can you talk about that element of it? Because I think most people probably familiar with how to make requests and get it through there, but they don't know that there's more.
Sure. Yeah. So let me actually, kind of have a quick kind of overview of like the history of Postman, because I think a lot of those ideas that Postman has now developed over a period of time. So Postman went out as a simple REST client in 2012, and what started happening was kind of like this, back and forth dialogue with a lot of developers on how they're working with APIs and where Postman fits into their API workflow. And what I saw was that not only are people using Postman to kind of send API calls, but they're also using it to kind of patch over a lot of deficiencies that are there in their traditional workflow. Like in some cases, documentation would not exist. In some cases, it's part of like a testing routine that they would do before they push to production and things like that. And I started kind of having these conversations, a little bit after Postman started gaining traction in 2012. And in 2013 and 14, kind of started looking more closely into the whole workflow of developers, whether it be small companies or large companies. And a lot of developers were very open with their feedback. So what we saw as kind of broken, me and my co-founders kind of at that time was people are going through a lot of different tools to execute like this thing that we call like the API development workflow. And there are lots of these points that are broken in this journey from thinking of an API and getting to the end of an API. And we thought that Postman kind of fits in these places right now. Like it patches over a bit of documentation, it patches over a bit of testing, but how can we kind of take it to the next level where everything is super streamlined and super smooth? So we envisioned kind of like Postman being a product that would help you design APIs, mock APIs, create documentation, and do that in a very simple, streamlined way. And now Postman has tools to kind of cover the entire workflow. I think we'll talk a bit more about deeper into each of these tools, what they do, but it covers kind of every aspect of the development lifecycle. And if you're a developer, if you're a technical writer, if you are building documentation, if you are a QA person, it does all of those things, and it integrates very deeply with the other tools that you would be using.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
No, please. You go first.
There's one feature that I think is kind of cool. It looks sort of simple on the surface. This run in Postman button that you can embed on a page, and people click it, and it launches their Postman client and populates it with all of the like sample requests or all the endpoints and parameters and so forth. Is that a popular feature? Or was that an experimental feature? Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the interesting things that we saw when Postman started getting adopted as a tool was, how does it spread, right? So Postman kind of grew from scratch, and now we have, I think, more than 5 million users using Postman kind of across the globe. And one of the things we saw was people sharing what in Postman you have a feature called, building of a Postman collection. And what a collection is, it could be a bunch of different things. It could be documentation, it could be sample requests, it could be automated tests, whatever you wish a collection to be. And when people would, ask someone else to use Postman, they would be like, hey, I tested out a bunch of calls with Postman. This is the set of calls that I tested it with, and take this collection and take Postman, and you will go a little further along with what you want to do. Now, we saw this happening over and over and over again. And we were like, how can we kind of make this process even faster? On the other side, we had a lot of publishers who wanted to onboard developers quickly onto their APIs. So there was kind of like this, need from a publisher side and this want from the developer side. And the run in Postman button kind of marries these two ideas, that you want developers to have quick access to the requests that they would want to play with, and publishers who want to get developers onboarded really quickly. So we launched it as an experiment. The idea was that just in a couple of clicks, you should be able to go from your API documentation on your website to Postman, and you don't have to copy over things over and over again or make mistakes. Again, kind of goes back to the same idea of not making mistakes when you're working with APIs. And we put it out. People like instantly adopted it. We had 10 15 publishers just at the moment we mentioned it, they're like we'd want to have it right away. And now we have transitioned this to the Postman API network. We have more than 100 publishers using the run in Postman button, or using our documentation which has the run in Postman button to onboard their developers. So it does a bunch of different things depending on what you want a Postman collection to accomplish. But it's been a very, very popular feature, and we see more and more publishers now using it as part of their documentation, and then other developers wanting it. They're like, where is the Postman collection for that, or would you have a run in Postman button, so I can just start using the API right away.
Here's why I like that feature so much. I'm a big fan of like Swagger UI and other sort of interactive documentation where you let users try it out on the browser, and people like that. That's part of the popularity of the Open API spec and the Swagger tooling. But it's sort of a fixed experience. You put in the parameters, you hit the button, and you see the response. What I think helps people learn the most is when they can simulate things on their own, when they can change. Maybe you add some more parameters or do a lot more customization. You want to save that, right? And you can't save your test call in Swagger UI. You need a local client like Postman where you save that stuff. So even if you have an interactive documentation output that lets users try it out in the browser, I think adding the Run in Postman button at least is also a huge, addition.
That's mostly been my use case. A couple of clients I work with who are using collections, I'm not doing a massive amount of actual documentation with the Postman platform. We'll come to that maybe in a minute. But it's more that they say, hey, Chris, document this. And I don't get any information. So it's a tool to experiment a bit to see what I need to document. And I can play around with things. And I have lots of work in progress tests with different parameters and options to see what the effects are, so I can document them effectively without having to do very much. That's sort of the point. But yeah, actually, it's interesting because I used Postman before I used Swagger. I've only just started using a project with Swagger actually. And there's a variety of reasons that Postman wasn't a good option for it, which I won't bore you with. But
I think we talked a bit about that from our last conversation.
No, this is something completely different. It's more the code base, and it's more the way the code base is created and stuff like that. But I'm going to ask you a slightly leading question because I know the answers. But what are the sort of two types of documentation that I could generate through using the Postman tool? I guess that's from the API spec, but also the kind of more free-form, conceptual, explanatory. It's late for me.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Tom, kind of going back to the thing that you kind of mentioned, right? Like you're using Swagger UI, and then it had this try it thing, and then you would want it in Postman because you want to save whatever you worked with again in Postman, and that is of some value to you. So we kind of very deeply believe that, and I think I'll share my perspective on what documentation is and how we see documentation get built up. And I think, Chris, that's kind of very related to your question on the types of documentation. So one of the things we started seeing, or at least the hypothesis was, like everybody wants great documentation for them, but nobody wants to invest as much time, as they'd like, as required to kind of build that documentation. The first thing that people want from a successful project is that it needs to have great documentation, and I need to know these things. I need getting started guides, I need tutorials, I need like reference documentation. And we always kind of looked at why it doesn't happen, right? And now with tools like Swagger UI or Open API specs, you can have a very top-down approach and say that this is how we're going to do it, right? It's kind of like a mandate that do it this way, and nice things are going to come out on this other end if we decide to do it this way, right? And what we saw with Postman was that documentation is more of an ongoing kind of process, right? One artifact of that is the final API documentation that you create, but fundamentally, kind of, I believe like all those journey steps are important, and they are documentation too. your experience of working with an API is some form of documentation. Your successes and failures are some part of documentation, and they could be then reused into teaching somebody else, right? Like documentation is not just like this fixed static document that you create and say that, okay, go and do it. But like all those different variations, all those paths, and both the successful ones and the unsuccessful ones are also part of documentation. So when we look at documentation, we look at like this entire user journey of building documentation and consuming documentation, and not believing in a way that you don't have to mandate that use it this way and certain things are going to come out. We think that collections could be getting started guide. So you can do that with Postman. You can build a collection and say that this is step 1, 2, and 3, and that's some part of documentation. You can create completed web pages, just like the way you have Stripe docs or API documentation portals, and say that these are all my calls, one after the other. This is what the structure of the API is. You can add markdown descriptions to it, and you will get a fully finished portal out of Postman if you wanted to. And it's in a consumable format. It's all backed by collection, so you can re-import that using the Run in Postman button into Postman and again play with it, right? The third thing that I'm very excited about personally is that Postman lets you create or lets you add kind of certain amounts of logic to documentation. So not just with the requests that you say that this is the request and this is the response. You can add JavaScript code to Postman. You can attach tests to it, and somebody who then plays around with documentation or that collection in Postman, can be told that, okay, this is what you did right and this is what you did wrong. So it's much more interactive in nature, and you can actually customize a lot of it to guide the user in the right way. I don't think any other tool kind of does this, but that's the one I'm most excited about. How can documentation be more in line with the user journey and not like a finished kind of artifact?
Just to very quickly confirm, though, in case people haven't used the tool very much in the past, you do have an option for kind of exporting to an HTML page. And how roughly, obviously it depends a little bit on people's configuration and setup, but how roughly would that look, just to describe to people?
So I think we modeled our base template on Stripe docs. It looks like a 3-column template right now. For internal documentation that Postman can do, you have the option of a 2-column template. So you have resources on the left-hand side. You have markdown descriptions on the right-hand side where your parameters are documented, and then you have code samples on the 3rd column. And Postman does both external documentation and internal documentation. So with internal docs, you get the 2-column template if you want to. So that's what it looks like in the browser. In the Postman app, you can expand a collection and see kind of a pull-out drawer where you can visualize what it'll look like when it goes to a web page. So it's available on both places. And actually, there is a third aspect to it, that with Postman, if you add descriptions to your request, they show up right next to the request too. So you can expand documentation in place, a request-specific documentation, and that shows up as part of the Postman request builder.
Did you for Postman's own documentation on how to use Postman? Does that use Postman, or is that a separate?
It's an ongoing project, and we can't do that. That's a good question. We need to make one customization there, like just not maybe have request, not use like the 3rd column for request responses, but I think outside of that, we can document Postman in Postman too. We do that for our API documentation. So if you go to api.getpostman.com,
I think
it's rendered.
That would be almost a travesty if you didn't, really.
I know, right? Like, yeah.
Hey,
we have to do that. Yeah.
I'd like to learn more about some of the auto-generated code from Postman. This is the feature where, let's say you've configured an endpoint and you're making the request and you think, this is great, but now in my docs, I want to provide a code sample for how to make the request in Java, Python, and PHP. And Postman lets you auto-generate that. But I'm never quite sure, since I'm not a programmer, if the code samples are totally accurate and like ready to go, or if they're just kind of generic and need to be customized. Like, how much faith can I have in these code samples? And from a developer's point of view, do they want ready-built code samples like that, or are they like, oh, I can just do that myself too?
So code samples, I think, are a pretty like interesting aspect for me in one way, right? And there are like lots of layers to it. I think in general, people dislike, just tons of code being generated for them. That's kind of not in their style, right? So that's one thing. They're like, if I don't have control over like, how it kind of looks like with respect to the rest of my code base, it doesn't really gel well. So Postman doesn't do that. It does, code snippets for requests that you build. And I've seen people being actually very, very excited about it, and a whole class of people who are not even developers. So for developers, what you get as an advantage when you're generating these code samples is that the point from a successful API request in Postman to a successful API request in code is very, very short, right? And actually, the idea for integrating code samples in Postman came from looking at Stack Overflow questions on like, this is working in Postman, doesn't work with my code, right? And turns out that, so many people are just wasting time in rehashing the same thing. And we were like, okay, let's put it there and see whether people will get some value out of it. So I've seen personally that, across all the snippets that we provide, people are very excited about it, and styling concerns and, other things, because it's a small snippet, unlike generating tons of code with a code generator, it's a small section that people can really, work with and be happy about. Because the core idea is that, yeah, I want to make that call successfully in my actual code and just have very, very few surprises. So, I mean, I've seen people pretty excited about it. In fact, there are more demands for opening it up. So people can add their own plugins and say that, okay, now I want it in my style, or I want like a specific language. So that's been on our roadmap to let people do that. Like you can add your own code gen and just, see things on the fly. Something hopefully that we expect will be out this year.
I actually, because I mean, my own personal experience with this sort of feature, not with Postman, actually with one of your rivals, was that if you're building an API, a pure sort of API, then the auto-generated code is kind of okay, because that's all you're really doing is authenticating and then sending a request and getting a response. If you're building an SDK, then it's different, because then the SDK has its own style. And that was our experience, that when we had the SDKs, these auto-generated code snippets were actually a negative, because they were completely contrary to the style the library developers wanted. So we sort of steered away from it ourselves. I mean, even on a day-to-day basis, just having the core request is quite useful, because that doesn't really change very much. But actually, talking about this feature you've just mentioned, I mean, without going into too much detail, because you're not an open source company, but how would you? I can't even imagine how you could incorporate something like that. Like the hundreds of different ways that someone might build their SDK. How could you have a feature that people could just plug in and out of so easily? I just sort of wonder from a roadmap perspective how you'd even do that.
Sure. No, that's a good question. And it took us a while to kind of realize what the right integration points would be. So, backing everything in Postman is a Postman collection, which I would say is, a similar idea to, things like OpenAPI or Swagger, but we I'd say are complementary in a certain sense, because of the documentation examples that we talked about earlier in the call. So what we call a collection is it's an executable API description, unlike static API description. And whatever is built on Postman is built on top of a collection. So when we do code generation, it reads the collection request and then converts it into the corresponding code sample, right? Effectively, you're doing a translation from this metadata to that code generation through taking it through that code generation logic and getting a code snippet out. So that's kind of like the base, which we expect developers will read off from, and actually a lot of developers are doing it already. Through our API, they bring in collections kind of are dynamically updated, and they convert it through their pipeline. So that's kind of already happening. With respect to the Postman app, we'd want a bunch of touch points. So like in the code generator example, you would install a plugin, and when that plugin gets called, it would read the collection definition and then convert it into a corresponding code snippet. And then one of the things that we've been working on is making the collection format just much more robust, having like types and folders and things like that, so that there is much more information that you can encode in the collection itself. So once you have all of these pieces, you can go both ways. You can generate SDKs on the publishing side and code snippets on the consumer side.
I have a question. Abhinav, on your LinkedIn profile, you say that you're on a mission to simplify API development. So, in your perspective, what is the most complicated or complex part of API development, and how do you simplify it? I know that's kind of a broad question, but
yeah, I mean, no, it is a broad question, because if I kind of go step by step, I'd say that so many things are complex with API development. I think generally one of the things we saw, right, like as developers, we are very, very good at creating tons and tons of abstractions. Like there are layers and layers of abstraction. When you want to write like a piece of code, you kind of wrap it around in a function, take it into a module, deploy the module in a container, put the container behind something, and then finally you kind of get this API call. And then there are levels and levels at each of these things, and it'll there's this notion of like a full stack developer, and if you go through that notion, you have to learn like so many different things. So I feel a lot of complexity in API development kind of comes from these unnecessary abstractions that we end up creating. And when it comes to tooling to work with these abstractions, there is a lot of debate and discussion on like the nuances of these abstractions, which in most cases are not are not useful, right? Like I'm speaking in a broad terms, but we could talk about specific examples. But I think Postman's goal is to just really make it simple to kind of get to the finish line, first quickly, just like the way sending an API call and making a successful request could be complicated. For example, when I started out, I'd go to people and be like, okay, how are you making API calls now? They'd be like, yeah, we write our own REST client, right? Like every single developer in the world was going and writing out their REST client, and they'd make the same mistakes over and over again. And it was supposed to be a good thing, right? Now we simplify that by saying that, okay, let's build a simple tool where the obvious things are, clearer in the interface. If there are issues, that you will see the tool's responsibility is to tell you where the error is, and then things a certain aspect of development becomes simple, right? So as we have gone through, let's take documentation as an example, right? Like when we talk about documentation, there is a whole chain of discussions on what the doc generator needs to look like, what are the kind of files you create, and which is a meaningful discussion. But what gets lost is what is good documentation. Now in Postman, what we did was our goal was you click a button and you get documentation, right? We'll sync up your collection files on the server. You click a button, we'll make sure it's up to date. The most recent copy of that collection is the one that's going to be used to build that web page. And that's pretty much it, right? Like it doesn't get simpler than clicking a button and seeing the final result. And we have tried to do that kind of over and over again. So wherever we see that there are lots of steps being taken to kind of get to the finish line, and there are some very obvious success paths through which we can take a developer or a user of Postman. We try to condense that path, right? Like it should be a single button. It should just be a couple of screens, and giving enough integration points for people to expand and build more upon. So that I hope that kind of answers your question. Kind of goes a little bit into the philosophy of how we think about the product, because none of these things are new things. We all agree that documentation needs to be done. There are hundreds of automation testing tools. There are lots of documentation tools, but we want to adopt that approach that we are aiming to be the simplest one of them, and seeing that as more people do it, we'll try to kind of keep simplifying. As more use cases get layered on, a tool has this tendency to become more complex, but then we try to fight against it.
Is there, so some of the other kind of similar codified API standards with the ability to generate documentation, there's we've mentioned a couple already. There's obviously others as well, like API Blueprint and RAML and a few others. And then there's other companies that do similar things to Postman. This is a very long lead up to a very simple question, but basically just with something like Swagger, for example, there's obviously some kind of companies around the core development, and there's their core tooling, but there's also a whole ecosystem of tools that people have built to kind of scratch their own itch. And my question really is Postman a sort of walled garden where you are the only one who creates the tools around it, or is it possible for people to create their own documentation generators from collections and easily? I mean, obviously they could probably do it if they really wanted to, but is it do it easily?
Yeah. We've been seeing it since like the day Postman had the concept of a collection. The collection format is open source. We have our SDK that's open source. The Postman runtime through which you run collections is open source, and we have our command line tool Newman through which you can which you do CI/CD integration. That's open source, and it's actually pretty. I mean, I was just looking at the numbers. It gets downloaded like some 150,000 times a month, like around that number. So all of these components are open source. We see a lot of developers integrating using these components. Sometimes inside companies, sometimes they have their own tools in the open source domain. So it's super easy. And in fact, again, going back to that notion of simplicity, we never really wanted to kind of make like a complex format, like things that would do like 500 different things. And there are lots of things where you can kind of get lost into, what's the meaning of this versus that. It's a simple JSON structure. Like you parse it and just kind of do whatever you'd want with it. If you want to, you can use our SDK if you're on Node.js. It's very simple to kind of use it to kind of create collections and consume collections. One of the interesting things actually we see, and that's on our API network as well now, that a lot of backend as a service providers generate collections on the fly. For, let's say you build your backend and then you're using that service, you would click the run and Postman button there, and the collection for your API can come into Postman, and they're using the format to do that. So there are lots of different integration points, and we are as open as we could be. For our API, we actually opened up access to the API for every signed up user. So you can access the API if you're signed up, and then we'll have your data, and you can get access to that data using API calls. So not only do we give you these formats, but we also have like the tooling and infrastructure to help you build whatever you want with it.
You got anything, Tom? Yep.
I think Tom is on mute. Yeah.
Sorry. This is kind of a trivial side question. So when you launch Postman and it's loading, you get all kinds of these cute little quirky statements like launching satellites, moving into position, fastening seatbelts, and it's like, what's the story behind that? Is that kind of like your fun play area? Do people get to contribute to that? Who's driving that?
Yeah, no, I mean, we wanted. That's a really good point, actually. Like, I'm glad you kind of like that. So one of the things about Postman that we've tried to do is, like, when we looked at generally API tooling being done by like big companies, enterprise class companies, it was just like so boring. Like I mean, as a developer, if you're working with APIs all the time and you see like this boring tooling with like I mean, you know about it, right? Like there are so many acronyms and so many
Right.
different things. We're like, we're going to like make something fun, and uh, with specifically with loading screens, there's always this challenge that at a technical level, I would not want to have that loading screen at all, right? Like that's the challenge for the engineering team, that please make it load faster so we don't have to show it. But if there is a restriction at some point, we were like, okay, let's at least make the notion pleasurable. It's not open yet, but what I'm now thinking is that we just spoke about plugins, right? I think there could be a plugin for that.
I think that's a dangerous idea. You could get all sorts of rubbish coming in. I don't know. Have to have a strong editorial process.
Yeah. But the notion for that was like, just be space themed. So this was one of the things that I was very excited about with Postman, is that we have like this whole space themed branding and the logo, and the notion there is that Postman is not a tool. It's something that takes you to the space age of developer tools. So it's looking forward and beyond, and like our whole branding and the whole messaging is kind of around that. And we have our own developers who are pretty excited about it. So they fill those loading screens with certain space theme stuff.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, I think there's some. Anyway, no, I know there's some technical reasons. One of the other applications that is famous for loading screens is probably Slack at the moment, and I think you both are probably using a similar technology to package up your desktop application, which is a little infamously slow. So, so you might those loading screens I think are essential. That's probably what it is. But I'd actually like to ask you a little bit about the API network. So this is something you announced relatively recently. It's not a feature per se. It's more kind of a highlight of people's APIs that they've built. And I think this is one of the things that sparked our interest in the first place, because we've had discussions on the show about the shuttering of the Stack Overflow documentation. And we also spoke with the Mozilla Developer Network people a couple of months back about various people's attempts to kind of consolidate documentation. That's not really what API Network is, but it's a if you wanted to, it could be. But I mean, there's some companies on here: PayPal, Box, Auth0, some sort of famous APIs, if there is such a thing. Are these like the core developer documentation for some of these companies, or are they like their API playground areas? Like what are people in some of these larger, more complicated tools using Postman for? Just an aspect of their developer documentation, or?
So the goal for the API network, kind of fundamentally, is to kind of connect developers with the most authentic, API definitions out there. So that's kind of like the first order goal. The second goal is to get developers access to other forms of documentation, which we spoke about, right? Not just definitions, but also kind of getting started guides and tutorials, which you can package in a collection and share it with other folks. So the API network kind of evolved gradually from how Postman is being used, and we had the run in Postman button and an own documentation system. And like what we heard a lot from the community was that the first thing I do when I want to work with an API is I want a Postman collection. I kind of immediately get started on that API the moment I bring it into Postman. And we had this hypothesis a while back that I believe very strongly in, is that people don't use your API in isolation. They use it with every other API that they're working with. So sometimes these might be internal APIs that you are building of your own, or sometimes you are combining multiple APIs to build new software, right? So it calls for a place where you can get access to all of these APIs quickly, and they are in a form that where you can recombine them and recombine them both with other APIs and as well as like your own APIs. And of course, Postman is the tool for that. So when we went around, talking to people, they were like, yeah, it'll be nice to just have this in Postman. And actually, Postman's API network is built in Postman now. So when you go and click the new button, you will see a tab there, and that's all it takes. Kind of import as many definitions as you want very quickly. So the goal for us is that we don't want to just curate API documentation and like some of the directories that have appeared before, where a middleman just comes there and says that, okay, I curated the top 50 documentation sites, and these are the ones you should use. What we want is to establish like a real connection between the API publisher and the developer, and publishers get a tool to reach out to developers, and developers get it in a format that they can actually use and get started with. So right now we have a curated set in the API network, but very soon we'll open it up to publishers. So you can just the moment you're publishing your API documentation, or you want to publish something like a guide or something, you can just publish to the network directly. So that's where we are going with it, with the notion that the more building blocks that developers have, the more validated ones, the faster their life cycle is going to be.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, I actually wasn't too aware of the API network. I was checking it out, and I'm like, oh man, this is cool. I'm gonna have to explore that more. But I think Postman is perfect for getting started tutorials. I mean, you can have somebody populate all the sample kind of calls and things quickly. They can run through all kinds of different scenarios. And from a tech writer's perspective, you don't have to try to say, okay, now you're gonna click the params button, you're gonna populate this here, and you're gonna do this for the authorization. It just have it be imported and already set up. I think that's huge, and so I'm definitely gonna try that more. Here's a kind of question that would give you a chance to also plug the tool more, but a lot of people use Postman in the free version. We use all this stuff. You can import your open API, and you can generate the run in Postman button. Why would somebody want to up level to a paid version? What do you get? What am I missing by just sticking with the free aspect of it, particularly from a documentation writer point of view?
Sure. So that's let me actually try to define where like our product line is. So one of the things that we had earlier was this notion that people are going to use like the Postman tool for a bunch of things, and then they're going to use our paid plans for a bunch of other things. And the other things are mock servers, generating documentation, and building API monitors, or getting access to the API. So that's what Postman Pro was when we started out with it. Now all these features are available to you even with the free version. Okay, they are available though till a specific limit. So if you want to try out mock servers, you can build a mock server in Postman, send up to 1,000 calls to the mock server, and after that, you will have to wait for a month if you want to use it more. In the Pro version, all of these limits go way higher, and you can send up to 1 million calls per month for a mock server, or you can have 1 million page views on your documentation, which is fairly large unless you have like really popular a really popular API, and that's available at like $8 per user per month. Now, one of the core things that you get with Postman, and that's where I think it's very tied to this notion of documentation, is you can work collaboratively in Postman. So we have this notion of a real-time collaborative development environment for your APIs, and with the paid version you get this team library where you can share your collections in, and other people can subscribe to those collections and work in real time with you. So if all three of us are working on a collection, I make a change, then it's going to reflect in your Postman copy instantly. We automatically diff the change, so you see that in the activity feed on how a collection has changed. Let's assume that we are building documentation through that collection. So you'll see actually, how the documentation has evolved over time. And instead of pushing and pulling from a repository, we can just work on one thing together. So that's what you kind of get with the paid version, and along with all the other features that are there, with more usage limits. Another aspect that you get with the paid version is integration. So you can send data off to GitHub and GitLab, and you can have the activity change log kind of come on Slack, and you can back up all your collections. A bunch of different things on the integration side. But one of the primary things that you get is like this real-time collaborative environment, and I feel like the more so one of the challenges we saw with people building documentation was everybody would work in their own silo, right? So developers are doing their own thing here, and technical writers are waiting for the latest copy of documentation to kind of come about. And on this side, you have QA folks who are doing their automated tests, and we're like, why are these people working on the same thing but working in different tools, right? Is there a way to kind of bring them all together? And if we bring them all together and everybody agrees upon a single source of truth for all of these things, then probably they'll work faster. So that's what the primary advantage of using Postman Pro is. Of course, you kind of get the tools, but you just work together as a team much faster, much better, and you can have as many kinds of people you want, because the tool is kind of pretty versatile. So we see developers actually working now hand in hand with technical writers and with QA folks that they did not do before. It was more of a waterfall model, but now you can just bring them all together and hash out documentation in a day. Developers can put sample requests that they used before and hand it over to technical writers, and they can build more finished documentation out of it. So lots of different possibilities, because now you're kind of together.
And that was actually the two clients I've used Postman with. One had it set up like that with the kind of Google Docs for APIs. And that was actually very effective. And the others, it was just uploaded and downloaded all the time. And there was like a missing semicolon in the collection file that just sat there for ages, and I couldn't change it, and that was super frustrating. Whereas, the other one, it was.
I know when that happens. We have permission control there, but it's up to the people who are authoring the collection.
We're coming up to the end of our time. Do you have any? I sort of have one remaining, just like wrap up. Quick question. Do you have anything, Tom?
No, I've really enjoyed all this, this conversation.
Very good.
It's been great.
So just one quick thing. I got a little bit lost in our sort of pre-chat communication about whether it was you or someone else, but I know in just over a week in Paris, and I'm in Berlin, so it's in my neighborhood. There's API of the Days, and I actually know a few people from the Write the Docs community in Europe are going. And I thought you were talking, but maybe it's someone else from your staff is talking, I think.
Yeah, my co-founder Ankit is going to be there. Yep. So I was completely set to go there, but unfortunately due to visa issues, and I can't make it this time. I was there for the last edition. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I will see anyone else who's there, including him. But I won't see you. Anything else you have coming up in the next sort of few weeks you quickly want to mention, or have we covered most things?
I think, we covered. I hope that the podcast reaches out to folks who are users of Postman, and then they find that there's so many things kind of already there that they can just get immediate value right away. So we have a lot coming up this year. Postman has grown a lot as a company in the last few months, and just one of the things we observed was that we're going to work on a couple of different paths, right? One is just this collaborative aspect that we just spoke about, kind of enriching it more and making it even more seamless than the way it is. I feel very strongly that source control systems are still kind of outdated for the kind of collaboration that we need now, with everybody kind of working on APIs, and they're not just developers who are working with APIs. So that's one track that we are going to explore a lot on. And on the second track, we spoke about plugins and how Postman is going to open up more and more touch points through plugins to the community. And in 2018, we are very excited about having plugins at the level of API definitions. So letting people just work with open API files and any format that they want to, and just have a much quicker exchange with definitions versus collections, and how they can operate with the Postman tooling just much more effectively. We see that as a very common need where people have toolings on both sides and they're plugging this together with our API. But these are things that are going to be just very fundamental parts of Postman this year. So pretty excited about that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Abhinav, for your time. Don't go to postman.com. That's a website that doesn't exist. The website is actually getpostman.com. I bet you're annoyed you couldn't get that website. I don't know who's got it, but it's not available. I don't know.
They're trying to find out. So the way to actually remember it is that get and post are the two HTTP verbs, right?
Very good point.
So,
nice.
So Postman actually, that's where the name comes from. Like, Postman is someone who helps you send requests. So post is an HTTP verb. And, getting something is easy, but posting is hard. So to remember the website, you just remember the first two HTTP verbs and you'll get there. So getpostman.com works.
Excellent. Just very quickly from the world of Write the Docs, you can always go to writethedocs.org for local meetups. We actually have one in Berlin tomorrow, but I don't think anyone's going to make that in time. And the Portland conference is coming up in May. I think tickets are available now. So if you want to come along to that, that's not far off in the future. For the podcast, and it's podcast.writethedocs.org for previous episodes, contact details, etc. And also, if you're on the Write the Docs Slack, then the podcast channel. We've getting a few people asking if they can appear on the show and having questions and things like that. Keep those coming through the website or through the Slack channel. And yeah, we'll try and arrange some future episodes with everybody. But in the meantime, thanks again for our guest. Thanks to Tom. Sorry Jared couldn't be with us this episode. So find all the contact details at podcast.writethedocs.org. And remember, I'll see if I can handle this in my best Jared impersonation. Docs or it didn't happen.